Hello to everyone and welcome to this panel on the impact of the Ukraine war on the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Ahmed Morsi. I'm the senior researcher at the Middle East and North Africa program at SIPRI. If you don't know about the MENA program, it's one of the thematic and regional programs at SIPRI. It uses multi-layered approach, combining micro and macro level analysis to socioeconomic and political dynamics in a way to understand the multifaceted challenges and opportunities in the region. Today, we have a stellar panel of friends and colleagues. And before I introduce them, I'd like to mention two quick things. This discussion is recorded and will be later available via SIPRI's YouTube channel. So wait for also an announcement for that later. The chat function is disabled. And if you are interested in sending us questions, and we really encourage you to do so, please use the Q&A button. We will collect these questions and try to answer as many of them. So please feel free to send those throughout the conversation that we're going to have. Next, I'm going to explain how we're going to run the session, which I hope all of you would contribute to through your questions. And also your follow-ups later. We welcome that as well. So I will introduce our esteemed panelists and follow that with a short description of the topic, where we will set the stage for the discussion. After that, we will go through 3 to 4 rounds of questions, where each of the panelists will will have like 3 to 4 minutes to respond and reflect to them, and share with us their experience and expertise on these issues and themes. This way we can keep the discussion more dynamic, and also each of our speakers can have a chance to continue the reflections, but also continue the conversation among each other through this discussion. Let me welcome them, and I will start by introducing Intisar Faqir. Intisar is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's North Africa and Sahel program in Washington, D.C. She has written extensively on key regional thematic issues that includes governance, social change, migration, and security in North Africa and the Sahel. Marwan Maashar, who is a vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Marwan has served before as the foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Jordan, and he oversees Carnegie's work in Beirut and Washington, D.C. His previous careers also spanned areas of diplomacy, development, civil society, and communication. Last but not the least, Cinzia Bianco, who's a visiting fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations, where she is working on political security and economic developments in the Gulf region and the relationship with Europe. She is also an analyst at the Gulf State Analytics. So let me start by setting this conversation in some sort of a description of how this panel, or why we are choosing this panel and why does it fit within the Stockholm Security Conference this year. While the conversation or the main theme is the battlefields of the future, of the Stockholm Forum, the Stockholm Security Conference, we thought that the MENA region has been impacted by a wide range of issues, and not only the type of battlefield, whether it's old style or futuristic, but also very much specifically how the war is impacting people's lives and governance across the board. So as we have seen, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shaken not only the long-standing foundations of European security, but also 9 months on, it has these wide-range impacts across the globe. So in the region, most of the states have refrained from an explicit condemnation of Russia's aggression and have not really joined fully the Western efforts to isolate Russia through the sanctions regime that has been advocated. In fact, we have seen bilateral meetings and phone calls between leaders from the MENA region or the MENA countries and Russia. The response from the countries to the war in Ukraine can be arguably seen as symptomatic to the shifts in the global order, particularly growing trends of multipolarity, as well as the erosion of multilateralism and international norms. This is not something new, and I think this is something that has been ongoing for the past 2 decades at least. The war also has amplified a lot of socioeconomic challenges that not only the war was the main reason for it, but also it resulted from closures and restrictions during the pandemic, things from supply chain issues to rising inflation and spikes of prices in hydrocarbons, grain, minerals, and other industrial and agricultural materials. This have created a completely different, maybe, dynamic in the region, where it's propelling energy-rich states to play a much bigger role, influencing regional international geopolitics, something that we're seeing some of the oil-rich Gulf monarchies are embracing at the moment. Also, it's highlighting heavy dependence of the MENA countries on grain imports, particularly, again, from Ukraine and Russia. And Egypt is a very big example, or a clear example of this case. The risks to the governance and socioeconomic dynamics are heightened through these food shortages and skyrocketing prices. This is something also that could have repercussions for stability and security in this already fragile region. This general introduction, now we're going to move more closely into specific questions and discussions that we'll ask our colleagues and friends here to respond to or reflect on. And we'll start with the first round that looks at the shifting geopolitics in the region. And I would like to start with Intisar and basically ask, how are you seeing these shifts happening, whether the shifts on a global stage towards the region, or a shift within the region, and particularly North Africa, as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Thanks, Ahmed. Thank you for having me. Yes, so along the lines of what you have highlighted in your introduction, for the Maghreb region, there have been some interesting geopolitical trends, some of which, of course, predate the war in Ukraine. And I think it's really sort of interesting for us to kind of look at and analyze this idea of sort of the coming of geopolitics to North Africa and the Maghreb beyond just the Libyan conflict, which is, the lens through which we use to see sort of, different geopolitical dynamics playing out in North Africa. To me, it's been interesting to see the attention focused on Algeria as a key supplier of energy to the EU, and how that plays out for Algeria's position vis-a-vis the EU. We've seen that especially over the past few months. Algerian energy sector, Algerian energy officials and foreign policy officials, there's really been sort of an outpouring of visits from EU officials and such. And it's interesting for me to kind of think a little bit through the implications of what that means for Algeria's position in the Maghreb region, the rivalry with Morocco, especially in light of Morocco's own growing ties with Israel, and I can get to that in a minute. But also in terms of, Algeria's position in the Sahel, where security implications are, of course, consequential for the Maghreb region as well. So, a lot is kind of playing out there. That's, of course, in addition to dynamics that had already existed there of kind of, North African partners trying to diversify away from a strong reliance on the EU and American actors. So you already have a context where Russia has been present. China's really trying to make inroads in terms of their own sort of investment and economic ties with North African partners. And then you have an additional layer now that, that is maybe focused more on energy. And to me, one of the most interesting things also to look at, again, is the presence of Israel there through Morocco. So in terms of the EU, and just to give a little bit more details, in the terms of the EU's focus on offsetting gas supply losses from Russia, through increasing supply from Algeria, has really, I think, brought a new dynamism to Algerian foreign policy. It's not just in terms of money and the income that Algeria has been able to make, But again, we see really, I think it's interesting to see how European partners are trying again to sort of balance between Algeria and Morocco in this Maghreb context, mainly through, the Western Sahara dynamics, where in the past they didn't really have to worry too much about that. And so, Algeria has traditionally, it's been a good partner to Europe. That relationship has been largely focused on trade, but now we sort of see almost the sort of foreign policy element of it is much more highlighted. And I think that fits in with the way that the Algerian foreign policy establishment has really sort of kind of been keen to reemerge after a few years of basically stagnation under the ailing president Bouteflika. This is towards the end of his reign and before the transition that Algeria had gone through in 2019 and 2020. So, they're more keen, they're more present, they want to play a stronger role. We've seen that a little bit through the Arab League summit that took place earlier this month. But I think, it's important to also just kind of temper a little bit some of that by emphasizing that, within the military establishment, which has a say in foreign policy engagement, it's not clear just how that dynamism is going to sort of play out yet. And another important thing to remember here, and I think it's an important thing to watch forward, moving forward, as you had mentioned, is that, Algeria has been a longtime partner of Russia. Algeria is a top procurer of Russian arms. And I think it would be really interesting long-term to see if the war impacts Russia's ability to supply Algeria with arms. What's going to happen to that relationship? How is that relationship going to shift? Just very briefly on Morocco's end, again, as I mentioned, it's interesting to see the full extent of normalization with Israel, which has quickly grown from this sort of very much a quid pro quo deal of Morocco renormalizing ties with Israel in exchange for U.S. recognition of Western Sahara. It has grown into a stronger bilateral relationship, especially on the military cooperation front. Morocco's been purchasing a lot of Israeli hardware, especially drone technology and missile defense systems. This again fits into their efforts to kind of improve their air defense, within the context of this sort of military rivalry with Algeria, which Morocco has been lagging, particularly on the air defense system area. But so they're trying to build their drone acquisition, which is sort of an easier and kind of cheaper way to make up a little bit some of that ground. Israeli drones have been the latest in a series of drone purchases from not just Israel, Turkey, China, the US, of course. But again, I think the kind of the sort of the element where Morocco sort of kind of uses that Israeli partnership to sort of, to give itself a little bit more, more presence on the scene and to also kind of, tell Algeria, look, we have access to all of this capability has been interesting to observe. And I think I say this because I think it can be tricky to determine what's just sort of a development and what's a trend shift. And I think for me, Morocco's relationship with Israel falls into that latter category. Very quickly, I will add, just briefly mention something on Libya and the Sahel. On Libya specifically, the rival movement dynamic continues with Russia, of course, is one of the few governments to have recognized Bashaga's government. The Libya-Russia dynamic and relationship, still very much hinges on the relationship between Moscow and Haftar. And that remains there pretty strong. Not much has changed, I think, in terms of Russia's engagement in Libya. There's been some initial reports in terms of, Russian troop withdrawals, but nothing has taken place that can significantly shift the domestic balance of power in that sense. In terms of the presence of Russian troops and mercenaries, and this, of course, also again extends to the Sahel. I think Mali specifically, I haven't really seen any definitive reporting of any major drawdowns. Wagner Group mercenaries have been operating in Mali and continue to operate in Mali. But what's, I think, interesting that's starting to emerge is this sort of realization or the question that they haven't had any major impact on terrorist operation there. And that was, that was the whole impetus. That was one of the main reasons why they were there. So in conversations with people in Mali and experts sort of tracking terrorist activities in the Sahel in general, the question often comes up, Russia has not really been able to do a whole lot in terms of terrorism in Mali, but Russia continues to sort of win, the public perception battle, I think, in the Sahel, especially if you compare it to France. And, disinformation and misinformation campaigns play a huge role in that. So maybe I can stop there, and I'm happy to go into any further details later.
Thank you, Intisar. This is useful and very helpful to also give us more of the dynamics that are happening across North Africa within, but also across the region. Shinsia, I think two of the main key items or elements that were brought in Intisar's intervention, or the first comments, are energy and Israel. And these have been also key items that have been changing within the Gulf, particularly, whether it's through the Abrahamic Accords or through now the role that energy has been playing vis-a-vis Europe after the war, particularly, or after the war has started in February. So if you can just guide us through, like, share with us your reflections on how this might be changing the geopolitics within the Gulf or across the Middle East, but also how can we understand the role of outside powers that traditionally have impacted maybe the Gulf's policies or their understanding of the role.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the kind invitation. The Stockholm Security Conference is always a very good place to be. And, it's very engaging conversations and the right questions to be asked. And indeed, I think what you said is really key. I do believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is already in the territory of geopolitical game-changing scenario. I think that, so what I start I like to start off with a summarizing sentence that sort of is meant to provoke, but also, I think, to provide a framework, and then we can color with the details. I believe that if the 10 years between 2011 and 2021 have basically solidified the Gulf monarchies' role as regional key players, the years that started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine may have elevated their role at an international level. So we have seen, after the Arab Spring, we have seen especially players like Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia basically being able to change the political future or influence the political and economic future of much larger countries that historically were much more prominent geopolitically in North Africa and in the Levant. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen these countries really do something unprecedented, which is enforcing their own independent path in global geopolitics. The main takeaway is that the United States has tried and failed to influence the Gulf monarchies for the first time, probably in decades, into what is a global confrontation that sees the United States engaged on the front line, or at least politically, right? Geopolitically on the front line. And I think, this is the main sort of takeaway that we have seen as a consequence of the Gulf monarchies becoming basically the most influential players on the global energy market, at a time when also energy prices skyrocketed. So after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had two things happening in the global energy market. The first one was that, due to embargo and sanctions, you had Russian energy, oil and gas, taken off the market rather quickly, taken off the official market, at least, rather quickly. And we all know that if supply remains more or less the same, if demand remains more or less the same, but supply significantly decreases, inevitably prices are pushed up. And at the same time, because Europeans needed to diversify as quickly as possible away from the dependency on Russian energy, they started flocking to the Gulf and trying to close deals to get some short-term support on diversifying their energy needs, but also longer-term conversations on longer-term strategic partnerships, because in many European capitals, the decision has already been made that the relationship with Russia, the energy relationship with Russia, is not going to get back to what it was before the invasion. And that's already, that's a decision that has clearly been made in many European capitals. So as a consequence of, those major energy developments in the energy market, you have Gulf players who are now benefiting from an incredible bonanza of financial resources. And they also, at the same time, are in a strong geopolitical position of making their own decision on where to channel that bonanza and those resources. And because they are much more confident in their shoes, because they are, feeling that they can play, for example, global powers of one another, including Russia against the US, or even more importantly, China against the US and vice versa. And also they have the Europeans that have much more significant interest towards them. They also have this confidence of really being in a position of determining where to channel those resources, and very clearly are going to direct those resources where they think that they can make a return on their investment, be it an economic, financial return or a political return. So I think, I want to keep it short. So this is sort of the first, some initial thoughts on how the geopolitics of the region have changed, and how that has interacted with a new multipolar region. And that is my concluding thought, that as we know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really cemented a multipolar order, and especially in the Middle East. And, that is very important for us Europeans to understand, because that will bring a lot of the fact that the US hegemony no longer is a thing, in my opinion, in the region, is going to have massive repercussions for Europeans and their interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinsia. That's very thought-provoking to start with. And Marwan, you have a long experience in diplomacy, in research, and being close to a lot of action, I would say. So would you, or how do you see this? Do you see a multipolarity that's forming up in the region? Do you see it more regional polarity, but not yet up to the stage of pushing against the world powers? How can we read what's going on?
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you for having me. I think the main takeaway for me, geopolitically, because there is another takeaway when we get to talk about food and energy prices, but geopolitically, what we are witnessing as a result of the Russian-Ukraine war is a direct explanation of America's withdrawal from the region. The US is certainly no longer the main player in the region. And that's partly the US decision, frankly. The US has taken a conscious decision to retreat from the region focusing more on China, on Russia, and other parts. And this has consequences. And this is one of the main consequences. You would think logic dictates that Arab states should unequivocally stand behind against the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, much like they have stood against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Arab lands. they have not done so. I mean, they've done so in a very timid or way. But clearly, many Arab states are hedging their bets, and they're hedging their bets because the US is no longer in town. Russia has used that vacuum in many ways, whether it is in economic ways, whether it is in arms sales, whether it is in propaganda activities, but Russia has managed to veer away traditional US allies in the region, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Who would have thought 10 years ago that the Saudis would openly defy Washington on a number of issues? And even though, Egypt also enjoys very strong ties with Washington, but it also enjoys strong ties with Russia, not only because of the food grain imports that it gets from Russia, but because of also arms sales that it is getting also. So we are clearly seeing a vacuum being filled. The other point I want to make is that there is a very strong anti-US feeling in the region. And so on a popular level, much of the popular support for Russia stems out of the fact that it is, standing up to the US. So anybody who stands up to the US is a friend, regardless of whether their actions are legal internationally or not. And we're seeing this very clearly. People are, not everyone, of course, but people are justifying the Russian invasion in a variety of ways, in ways that they do not justify the Israeli invasion, for example. Public opinion has also been affected by what is seen as the different treatment of Ukrainian refugees than Syrian refugees, for example, particularly in Europe. And so that has added fuel to those who believe that the West has a double standard policy when it comes to the region. The vacuum that exists in the region because of US withdrawal is not just being filled with Russia. It is also being filled with China. China is flooding the region with money and no questions asked, unlike what US money, for example, is bringing. So we are, I hate to say that there is multipolar, if you want, competition in the region between the United States and Russia, let's say, as we have seen in the past. I'm not sure there is that competition. The US is not there. Other than the Iranian fight, and other than promoting in some ways the Abrahamic Accords, the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, has withdrawn from Iraq, is not doing hardly anything on the peace process, has a very limited presence in Syria. And so the fact to me is that the US does not care about this region in the way it used to before. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and I was struck by the fact that nobody asks any question about the Middle East anymore, not even about the US-Saudi tension. People don't care. People are focused on China. People are focused on the Russian-Ukraine war. They don't care what is happening to this region. Whether that is going to continue or not is an open question. I think it will. And I think that the region needs to understand that it has to take things in its own, control and not rely on the United States in the way that they used to before.
Thank you, Marwan. If I can just do a quick follow-up on this before we move to the next theme or question. What you ended the comment with was that the US does not care as much. People are not asking many questions about the Middle East. But at the same time, even with the shift that they are having towards standing against China, the US has traditionally, when it goes through these bigger confrontation, tries to bring other allies on board. If it's not bringing Middle Eastern allies on board, then how does it plan to fight a bigger contender like China, or even China and Russia at the same time, especially as we are seeing Europe kind of not fully in lockstep with Washington, and just simply the German chancellor was just in China, a lot of other news about trying to open avenues with the Chinese to help maybe stop the war, but also to open other spaces for engagement with the Chinese. You're on mute, Marwan.
Somebody muted me. The battlefield between US and China is not the Middle East. The battlefield between US and Russia is not the Middle East anymore. It used to be, but it is today. I mean, if you read the national strategy of the United States regarding China, you would see some of, what they hope to achieve, but it does not, that has little to do with the Middle East. The Middle East is no longer of the same importance to the United States that it was before. The United States today is a net exporter of oil. Yes, its allies still, rely on Middle East oil, but it does not rely on Middle East oil in the way it used to before. The public opinion in the United States is very strong and bipartisan against US, at least military intervention in the region. And even on the Arab-Israeli conflict, the US public position is that there's little to do now, and all they hope to achieve is a long-term truce until somehow miraculously the conditions are ripe again for progress on the front. So it is, once again, in my view, a conscious US decision. And it is not a decision by the Biden administration, by the way. This decision goes back all the way to the Obama administration. After the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, I think we have seen a public opinion that has held steady over the last 15 years that is strongly against US military intervention, not just in the Middle East, but around the world.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So I think this takes us to the next segment of this conversation, and I would like to focus more internally in the region, the impact, and I mentioned in the starting explanation about this session is energy, food and grain, climate. All of these are impacting, not necessarily just because of the war, but some have been ongoing for many, many years. And I think there is a bigger question now regarding governance at some of these countries, how they are governed, what avenues the publics have vis-a-vis the governments that are in charge. Also, to what extent some of these bigger questions, whether again, energy, food, climate, and others, could have impact on socioeconomic dynamics, potential for unrest, particularly for countries that have been really in harder security measure in terms of governance in the region. And of course, after over a decade of both aspirations for freedoms and change, but also civil wars that has been continuing so far. So going again into one of those rounds, so Intisar, if you can take us into dynamics within North Africa. You mentioned Algeria and the money that has been going on or coming in from energy. How does it plan to use it? How is Morocco affected by maybe some of the recent droughts and climate issues for its agriculture, for instance? How Libya, a country in civil war, for instance, is also seeing more income from oil. But maybe this is not going to be enough to resolve some of the tensions within. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. I think in terms of impact, in some ways, as you're explaining, looking specifically at sort of the broader context, there have been some similarities across Maghreb countries. Similarities in terms of the sort of the overall impact of the global economic picture. You've got inflationary pressures on top of already stressed out economic systems that haven't quite recovered from the post-pandemic period. That's definitely, I think I would say that's the case for all of them, but then different in terms of the ability to respond to these crises. Certainly energy exporting countries, particularly Algeria, I would say, have done quite well in terms of income during this period, which has sort of helped them, cushion a little bit from the blow. Just to give a little bit more detail, again here, I think it's important to remember just the extent to which a lot of these economies hadn't really been able to recover fully from the disruption of the pandemic. And it's not just in terms of sort of, the suspensions that we saw over the course of the pandemic itself, but also sort of, the second order effects of higher inflation, higher commodity prices, particularly food costs, and with the Ukraine crisis, even just the question of food availability in some places like Tunisia and Algeria, and of course the really high fuel prices, particularly in places like Morocco and Tunisia, while at the same time, employment remains high. In some cases, it's quite on the same level as even during the pandemic phase. So I would say just to, the high inflation, I think, has really impacted people's ability to afford life's necessities. It's really remarkable the extent to which I think vast numbers of low income and middle income families in Morocco, Algeria, even Algeria and Tunisia are really just struggling to afford to buy food, to live, and add to that a picture where even before the pandemic, we had seen poverty rates increasing. And really, I think the struggle is sort of pushing people to the breaking point. Again, this context of disgruntled citizens lacking rights, lacking, the ability to meet their basic needs, and basically kind of trying to explore new ways to redefine their status and sort of challenge autocratic regimes. That to me continues to sort of be the dominant headlines when you look at populations across the Maghreb. So to give a little bit of detail, since you specifically asked about Algeria, I think, certainly Algeria has economically and the government particularly has benefited financially, as I like the word that Chinzia used, a bonanza. They've really been making quite a bit of money from all of the gas sales, especially. Again, this is a country where hydrocarbon exports makes up 95% of exports. And they, through the income over the course of these past almost a year, they've been able to offset some of the economic pressures that the country had faced even during the pandemic. If you recall, the conversation about Algeria used to be dwindling foreign reserves, dwindling state income. That's no longer really the case. So now they have money. We see some of that spending help kind of offset some of the reductions that the government has planning to make to various state budgets. The financial outlook has given the state the ability to maintain subsidies and to maintain public spending. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind here that the sort of long-term cycle continues. In addition to all of the ideological and institutional barriers to reform that already exist in Algeria, every time Algeria's income from hydrocarbons starts to lessen, the government starts to talk about necessary, painful reforms, about liberalization to some extent. But then, the cycle changes, more oil money comes in, and then, of course, all plans to invest in structural reforms, to cut subsidies, to invest in renewable energy for Algeria specifically, all of that talk is essentially abandoned. So this is the cycle that I think Algeria finds itself in today. And it'll be interesting to see, long term, how much they can actually keep putting off some of these necessary reforms. For Morocco, interestingly, Morocco has had a bit of a stronger, they've had a little bit more ability, more resilience, because they had a stronger economic performance last year. There was a good agricultural yield. But this year, of course, between the drought, between the cost of food, people really are struggling. Yes, the country has managed to keep inflation at about 6.4%, which is quite a bit low compared to neighboring economies. But don't forget that Morocco is a low-income country. It has a low purchasing power, so this is a huge burden for citizens. Again, the same thing for Morocco as well. They pushed off plans to cut subsidies. And more interestingly, the conversation that was really compelling about the need to build, to prioritize human development after 10 years of not doing so, has again been put on hold because of the need to address public finances within this sort of critical period. And then, of course, I have to talk about Tunisia, which is the most troubling, as you've heard and you've seen, shortages of flour, sugar, milk, coffee. We've seen the scenes in supermarkets. The impact of the pandemic on most Tunisians had been devastating. And it comes on the heels of years of slow domestic production and gradually increasing external debt. So it's a really vicious cycle that Tunisia finds itself in. And then on top of all of that, you have a political situation that is, very troubling, and it's making resolving the economic situation that much more difficult. President Qais Said had essentially rationalized his takeover over a year ago by claiming that it will improve deadlock and simplify decision-making to really address some of these economic problems. That has not been the case. The economy is still facing all of the major problems, to put it mildly. And now, in addition to all of that, you have a strong presidential system, which of course opens the door to greater authoritarianism. Yes, the country has secured a staff agreement deal with the IMF to improve some of its public finances. Again, this is not going to transform the economy. And there are, of course, the concerns will remain about the impact of some of these austerity measures and subsidy cuts on the Tunisian publics, even though the IMF has reassured that they will be phased out. So I think the social pressure is going to remain. It's not going to go anywhere.
Thanks, Saad. This is very useful. Shinsia, any changes do you see with regards to some of those? I mean, we talked energy is again bonanza for the Gulf and other oil-rich countries. How would this be channeled? How is this going to be used? Is it going to be going into more developmental, climate change, fighting climate change, more energy, renewable energy spaces, or is it going to be channeled into other areas that we're not yet seeing, whether it's arms, whether it's other forms of power that the Gulf would want to see?
Thank you so much. And I also want to build on what Marwan said and Intisar just said in her second input. So Marwan rightly said, the US is no longer as interested, and in the region we have to take matters more into our own hands. And I think it is already happening to a certain extent. But that poses another sort of interesting set of other sort of answers and points. And also, if the regional countries take matters more into their own hands, that also means that the regional countries will shape their policies based on their interests and their own priorities. And that is a very innocent and simple thought. But if you sort of then look closer up to that, and for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia's energy policy, that's exactly what the Saudis claim they're doing. They claim they are just looking after their own interests. And at that point, you enter into a situation whereby governments and leaders and more generally speaking, define their own interests in the way that they see fit. And given that we have a wave of nationalism in the region that is starting really at the top, then, those interests are often defined in a very narrow way, in a very tactical framework. And that also has impacted the way that the Gulf monarchies in general have been looking at how to deal with this obvious crises that Intisar talked to us about, especially in several North African countries, how to what to do about inflation and soaring energy prices and the food security crisis, and how to manage the fact that they, unlike the rest, much of the rest of the region, have a better are better positioned into managing these crises. And for example, at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, all of the Gulf countries basically understood that there was this food crisis, food security crisis implications, and they went on the market, and because they had better financial means, they bought up a lot, and they were absolutely fine. Even this, bulk buying at that specific time actually contributed to the problem in other countries that did not have the same means, both increasing the prices and lowering availability. So, and then, when you discuss, for example, from a European point of view, because I do work at the European Council on Foreign Relations, when we discuss in European settings, the necessity of containing the impact of inflation and energy prices and food security crisis on the North Africa and the Levant, because we firmly believe that we have to sort of avoid the worst case scenarios of chaos and instability and possibly leading to violence. And then we start thinking about the regional countries, the winners, the oil exporting countries, playing a more active role. We often sort of realize that we start off from very different places, and we may want the same thing, which is a peaceful and prosperous region, but the way that we think this thing should be achieved is completely different. And you just have to look at Lebanon, for example, and that the case is very, very clear of a completely different approach, for example, from Saudi Arabia and France, both very engaged, both very interested, but engaged in a very different way. Thanks.
Thank you, Shinsia. Marwan, I think the deck of cards is stacked in a way that there are so many pressures going on a lot of these regimes, particularly the non-wealthy ones, particularly the very autocratic ones. And yes, we're not in the business of saying when something might happen, but what might happen actually? Is it protests? Is it some of these regimes might actually recognize that they need to change something, so they let some steam off and allow for some symbolic changes? What are the options that we're looking at? Particularly that even if the current energy and food and inflation crises maybe ease off in a year or so or more, climate is not going to change or ease off that quickly or that fast. So how do you see some of these more localized issues in the region?
Sorry, I think it is safe to say that the status quo is not sustainable. The Russian-Ukraine war has not started the deep economic crisis that oil importing countries in the Arab world particularly face, but it has certainly deepened it. Remember, this is the fourth crisis in a decade that the Arab world is facing. We started with the Arab uprisings in 2011, then the decline of oil prices in 2014, then COVID, and now the Russia-Ukraine crisis. That has resulted in an unprecedented rise in food prices, energy prices, unemployment, debt, and inflation. All of these economic indicators are going in the wrong direction. Like I said, for oil importing countries. In the past, the situation was handled through two tools: either use of security to maintain social peace by brutal force, or through financial resources. Even for oil importing countries, either getting money from in the form of grants or investments from oil producing countries, or from the open market. But the fiscal space has shrunk tremendously now. Today, oil importing countries in the Arab world have to compete for money with the whole world after COVID. It's no longer, the money is no longer as available as it used to. Oil producing countries are not as generous as they used to in the Arab world. Jordan is not getting hardly any money from the Saudis. The Gulf is giving Egypt some money, but in the form of investments. They're refusing to give sort of the outright grant assistance, no questions asked. That was the case before. What does that mean? For oil importing countries, and without any dramatization, I will say that if we are to have another wave of uprisings, I think this is going to be the main reason. Countries like Egypt, countries like Tunisia, countries like Lebanon, and others, of course, are really in trouble. And depending on the length of the Russian-Ukraine war, if it goes on for quite some time, then these countries are not going to be able to meet these challenges and meet the basic needs of citizens. For oil-producing countries, of course, the war has resulted in a windfall profit for them. The IMF estimates that Gulf countries are going to have extra reserves of $1.3 trillion over the next 4 years. What does that mean? Because of the decline of oil prices in 2014, we have witnessed many Gulf countries starting to do the right thing economically, not politically, trying to diversify their economy, imposing income taxes, removing subsidies, etc. Now they're getting all that money back. The question is, how are they going to use this money? Are they going to use it to the way they did in the past and waste a lot of it? Or are they going to use it wisely and prepare for the future? That's not a question that is answered today. But I once again don't want to underestimate the effect of the Russia-Ukraine war on the region. It is going to be, if you combine it with all the other crises, it's going to be major.
Well, thank you. And I would like to also remind all our participants or attendees that they can share their questions in the Q&A, and we already have some that we will come to. But I would like to go quickly and ask, ask you about the three countries that we didn't really talk about so far, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, who play a big role, and I would say even a much bigger role than it used to be decades ago. Intisar early on talked about Morocco and Israel, and then we brought in Israel in the conversation about the Gulf early on and how the Abrahamic Accords are looking. But right now, these three countries are having maybe an outsized role that they are playing in the region. One of them, Iran, has been seeing a lot of protests recently. And surprisingly and interestingly, I think, a lot of it is not necessarily just surrounding the idea of the hijab or not. It's a long list of grievances that the Iranian population have had against either the regime or others, which resembles what Marwan was just talking about in Egypt or in Tunisia or in other countries. So how do you see the role of these three countries briefly, if you would like to take a quick stab at this? Marwan,
who are you asking?
Yeah, you can start, and then we can have Shinsia and Intisar.
Well, Israel is moving in a very dark direction. I think, again, without dramatizing, I think apartheid is no longer a future threat. It's an actual reality. You have a racist government. There's no other way to call it. Even the US government calls members of, or certain members of, the Israeli government as racist. You have a government that is not interested in peace. You have a government that thinks that through the Abrahamic Accords, through relations with the Gulf in particular, it can bypass looking at the Palestinian question, and that it no longer needs to talk to the Palestinians, which is, in my view, a very short-sighted policy. And so we're going to brace ourselves for a very dark period, in which I believe that the conflict is no longer going to be about the shape of a solution. I mean, if you frankly hear people in the international community talk about the two-state solution, it's becoming a joke. It truly is becoming a joke that, one side adheres to a two-state solution and the other side is just swallowing the land and building more settlements on it. I think the conflict is moving from one that is focused on the shape of a solution to one that is going to be focused on rights. Remember, this Israeli government has members that are openly calling not for the expulsion of Palestinians under occupation to other countries in the region, but the expulsion of its own Palestinian citizens. And so it is increasingly becoming a battle of rights, rather than what shape of a solution we're going to have. On Iran, the uprisings are serious. I mean, it's far too early to predict where they will go. What I think we can predict is that an agreement with the United States over the nuclear issue is going to be impossible while these uprisings take place. You cannot sell this agreement to anybody and say, you're rewarding the Iranian regime while the protest is going on. But to the region, any agreement on the nuclear file is mixed. Is going to be met with mixed reactions, because yes, on one hand, it might prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb. On the other hand, it might release funds to Iran that it will use for further interference in the region's affairs. So it's not a black and white outcome. Let me stop here because I've been talking for too long.
Thank you. Shinsia, Intisar, do you have any reflections on the role of Turkey, particularly vis-a-vis North Africa, or also in relations with the Gulf? We have seen more normalization that's happening from Turkey and the Gulf. And then we also have seen a lot of expansion of the role of Turkey in a country like Libya, for instance. Comments, thoughts on this?
So I'll take up the word just for a quick reflection. I think, that because this is called the Stockholm Security Conference, I think we also have to try and, sort of coming to the end of this session, look into the future in terms of security implications. And I have been saying that, already for several months, when we were seeing de-escalation in the region, I've always called it a strategic pause, with the expectation that would be short-lived or in any way temporary, and that it would be fragile and couldn't really sustain too many shocks. And I think, that we're already starting to see that, because as Marwan was saying, the JCPOA talks, I mean, the protests in Iran basically make the JCPOA even less likely, but anyways, the negotiations were going very poorly already. And that has, triggered a new wave of threats, and of escalation rhetorically, at least between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi intelligence saying that they were expecting a hybrid attack from Iran against their territory. And again, Marwan was describing the new government in Israel and the direction they're taking, and how sort of dangerous that could be for stability. I think that we're already starting to see probably the end of this strategic pause of the escalation in the region, or at least a massive sort of downsizing of some of the de-escalation will survive, some of those, at the bilateral level, but some other processes will probably be sort of upturned. And I think it's good to start thinking about it already and try to think ahead a little bit.
Thank you, Shamsia. Intisar, do you have any reflections on this before we take some of the questions from the audience?
I don't have a lot to add on Israel beside what I said and what Marwan has added. In terms of Turkey, yes, Turkey, I consider Turkey as one of the sort of, players. When we talk about the abundance of international players active in North Africa, Turkey has certainly been one of them, beyond just the Libya conflict, where you have, Syrian fighters still on behalf of Turkey still involved in Libya. There is also Turkey's strong relationship with other North African governments, including Algeria and Morocco. So Turkey's economic engagement in North Africa has been notable. To me, it's interesting to see how the domestic economic implications in Turkey are going to impact the role that it plays in terms of economic engagement in North Africa. But I think another important thing to also keep an eye on is the way that Turkey has become increasingly a supplier of drones and arms to North African countries, Morocco, as I mentioned, Algeria as well, but also, of course, throughout African conflicts as well. I think there needs to be a really big conversation about drone technology and the way that it has been devastating and playing out in different conflicts in Africa. For example, the conflict in Ethiopia and such. So that's also another point to kind of keep in mind moving forward. Ahmed, I see a couple of questions that I might be able to weigh in on the Q&A. Do you want me to address those, or?
Yes, I think that would be great. So we have a couple of questions on Morocco, Algeria, Morocco, Polisario. I think that could be a very good way to look into them.
Yeah, so in terms of the Polisario question, I'll take the whether there is a possibility of peace agreement between Morocco and the Polisario. This is very much at the heart and is a priority for the UN envoy on Western Sahara, Staffan de Mistura, as he he has been engaging in a lot of talks across the board with everybody, as his successors have done. But for him, the challenge is twofold, because first of all, he has to essentially see if there is a way to reactivate the ceasefire agreement. And the ceasefire agreement has been breached since November 2020. So there's been an active conflict that's been going on. It's still a fairly lazy conflict, as I've heard it referred to. There's some fighting, but there's not a lot of fighting. There are some casualties, not a lot of casualties. So in that sense, it does not draw too much public and international attention. But the problem with securing a ceasefire agreement is that for the Polisario right now, they see the resumption of active conflict as their main and possibly only negotiating tactic. So it'll be very, very difficult to get them to come to the negotiating table, with already an agreement to essentially go back to the ceasefire. So I don't see the ceasefire happening outside of the broader negotiation about a settlement for the Western Sahara. And I think that, of course, that sets up the issue, several steps back. But so there is a big hurdle there for the new envoy and his team. On the other question that I see, how will the deterioration of Morocco and Algeria security impacts that of Spain and Portugal. In terms of the overall sort of the kind of the prospects for an active conflict between Algeria and Morocco, the tensions are high. But and I have been saying this ever since the diplomatic situation has gotten tense, is that I still don't think there is a reason to worry about any kind of active conflict. And I don't mean, you know, an all-out war here. I mean just even sort of like border skirmishes and such. They, you know, they're still, I think both regimes still understand that it's not in either of their advantage to actually engage in any kind of active fighting that could be destabilizing, even again here in border regions. But keeping the tension high really helps them. It helps them regionally. They get to sort of flex their muscles. They get to justify things like the normalization deal with Israel. They get to justify the sort of the heavy and growing influence of the military in domestic affairs on the Algerian side. So I don't see any reason for either one of them to really lower the tension at this point. But I also don't see a big possibility or even a small possibility of any kind of active conflict that would impact northern neighbors. There was, just very quickly, Ahmed, sorry, there was a quick moment where I think after the Arab League summit, where we saw sort of maybe potentially there could be some sort of dialogue that could be generated. And I don't think anything has come of that. But I think it was really crucial for international partners, be they the US, be they the EU, Gulf countries maybe, to sort of see if there's a way to get these two partners or these two neighbors talking to each other once again.
Thank you, Intisar. Shinsi, I think if you can give us quickly in a minute or two more about the strategic pause concept, and also if you can reflect on what this means. If the strategic pause ends, what does it mean for a country like Syria, for instance, where Russia exists, the US exists, Turkey exists, in addition to a lot of other local players?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. I mean, I think the strategic pause is basically a time where, you know, regional countries have looked around them and basically understood that many things were changing at a regional and global level, and it was time to, and their current strategies of confrontation that they have embraced after the Arab Spring in 2011 were not really working. So I'm talking specifically the main rivalries between, for example, Turkey and Qatar on one end, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other end, Saudi Arabia and several of the Gulf countries on one hand, and then Iran on the other end. And they basically looked around, and when the pandemic hit, they realized that they were spending a lot of resources and efforts into furthering their own agenda and interests through active confrontation with the regional rivals, but that wasn't really going anywhere. And anyways, you know, everything was put on ice during the pandemic, obviously. And then at the same time, it was really at the end of 2019 where it was clear that Republican or Democratic administration, as Marwan already said, that doesn't make a difference in terms of the US withdrawing from the Middle East, from the active and super engaged role that they had in the region in the past. And so all of these things were happening, and the government decided that it was time to cool off tensions, because they weren't really being productive into furthering their agenda, and rethinking the geopolitical dynamics within the region, within the Middle East and North Africa region. But again, it was clear that none of the structural problems had actually been solved, and none of the drivers of the conflicts were really going anywhere. So in this sense, it was a pause, and it was very fragile to external and internal shocks. And obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was a pretty big one. And Syria, as you mentioned, is really, unfortunately, sadly, the candidate for for further escalation because of the reasons that you already mentioned. All of the main global and regional players are already involved. The conflict hasn't really been resolved one way or another. I mean, we always say de facto the regime of Bashar al-Assad won the war, but de facto is not actually winning the war, so it could be reopened, and already we are seeing things happening there. We are seeing the Russians, for example. Now it's literally a news from today. It seems that they have taken a sizable number of Syrians with them in Ukraine, and that opens a whole other kind of worms. So it is in fact Syria a candidate for further escalation.
Thank you, Shinsia. So we're coming to the final 2.5 minutes of this very interesting and engaging discussion that I hope that we can continue in other also sessions and events. I would like to ask you each quickly in like 1 minute maximum to just tell us 1 or 2 things that you're watching for in the coming months. It can be directly from the war in Ukraine or just more simply from within the region itself. But I think it would be great if you can leave us with 1 or 2 of these things that you're thinking about. Marwan?
On the optimistic front, I would hope that the economic crisis, unprecedented in the region, is going to force Arab governments to do something, both economically and politically. That's, of course, wishful thinking, but that's my optimistic side. We don't know if that's going to happen. On the pessimistic side, if the war continues for a long period, I'm very worried that we might be witnessing another wave of Arab uprisings, which is going to be driven by food, by economic issues rather than by political ones.
Intisar?
Yeah, very similar points to what Marwan said, but maybe I'll start with Russia, the geopolitical sort of picture. I think it'll be interesting to sort of observe what the impact of the ongoing war, and particularly the sanction regime, is going to be on Russia's both presence physically on the ground, as Cinzia mentioned, but also the extent to which its role as a major supplier of arms and sort of hardware, how that changes some of the existing relationships with these long-standing partners in North Africa and in the African continent in general. So that's one thing. In terms of China and Chinese economic involvement, I think it's an interesting mixed picture. And I would continue to sort of look as China sort of reassesses its own Belt and Road Initiative and also global development initiative throughout Africa. It'd be interesting to see how that relationship continues forward, because I think for North Africa, it's been a mixed picture. It's definitely not been as much of a windfall as I think some of these regimes had hoped it would be. And then, of course, just to highlight what Marwan said in terms of government's responses, I think that's really crucial. We have been, I think for a lot of regimes in the region, they have definitely come to the realization that they need to address the economic circumstances of their populations. And one of the sort of the kind of value proposition that they have set up is that let us be as autocratic as we want, but also trust that we will give you some relief on economic front. This is the implicit agreement that they have sort of put forward before the pandemic and even throughout the pandemic. But the question is, they're not able to deliver on even that sort of economic improvement part of the proposition. And so the question is, at what point is that going to really sort of drive the populations out to the street and to challenge these regimes, as Marwan said?
Well, thank you. Cinzia, your thoughts just briefly, because we just have to end this. Sorry.
Yeah, I know it's it will be very brief. I'm watching the protests in Iran because I do, calculations, cold-blooded calculations could tell us that that the population will not be able to unseat the regime due also to the violent oppression. But I think, you know, these things can really not be forecasted in cold blood. So I think we should really watch that courageous movement very, very closely.
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you for all of you who attended and listened to these engaging comments and conversation. I'd like to thank you all again for being here. And in closing, it would be great if you could also join us at 2:30 Central European time for a session on multilateral sanctions and trade controls that will look at the current and future impact of the war on Ukraine on these mechanisms. Thank you again for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing the three of you in person soon, but also to have many of the attendees join other sessions of the forum. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.